Picture this: the year is 1453, and the once impregnable walls of Constantinople tremble under the relentless assault of history's most fearsome siege engines. Flaming projectiles arc through the smoke-choked sky, while beneath the earth, shadowy figures dig tunnels filled with explosives. This isn't just war, it's a high-stakes game of cunning, terror, and raw ingenuity, where victory hinges not just on strength, but on outthinking your enemy at every turn. Medieval siege warfare was a brutal spectacle, a clash of minds as much as steel, where every tactic, from psychological terror to biological sabotage, could turn the tide of an empire. What made these sieges so extraordinary wasn't just the scale of destruction, but the sheer creativity of the strategies employed. Imagine armies launching rotting corpses over city walls to spread disease, or defenders pouring boiling oil on attackers scaling ladders in the dead of night. Siege warfare was a theater of desperation and genius, where inventors became war heroes, and a single innovation like the trebuchet's deadly precision could rewrite history. Behind every crumbling fortress lay secrets, hidden passages, whispered betrayals, and machines so advanced they'd rival modern engineering. In this video, we're pulling back the curtain on these dark, dazzling arts of medieval warfare. You'll uncover how tunnels became deadly traps, how starvation was weaponized, and why some sieges dragged on for years, until a single moment of brilliance or brutality decided everything. This is the untold story of how civilizations rose and fell, not just on battlefields but in the shadows beneath them. So ready your curiosity, because what you're about to discover will change how you see the Middle Ages forever. To understand medieval siege warfare, you have to think beyond simple battles. This was an entire science of patience, engineering, and psychological torment. At its core, a siege was about control, cutting off a fortress or city from the outside world, choking its supplies, and waiting for desperation to do the dirty work. But it was never just about waiting. Commanders had three brutal options: starve the defenders into submission, smash through their walls with sheer force, or break their will through terror or trickery. And when a castle's gate slammed shut, time itself became a weapon. Some sieges dragged on for so long that children inside the walls grew up never knowing life outside the shadow of war. Take the siege of Jerusalem during the First Crusade in 1099. Christian forces, fueled by religious fervor, surrounded the holy city for weeks, tightening their grip until famine and thirst left the defenders gaunt and hopeless. When the walls finally fell, the carnage was apocalyptic. Or consider Château-Gaillard, King Richard the Lionheart's so-called impregnable fortress, which fell in 1204 after French troops discovered a hidden latrine chute and crawled straight into the heart of the stronghold. These weren't just battles, they were chess games with lives on the line, where a single weak point or a traitor's whisper could doom thousands. What made sieges uniquely terrifying was their inevitability. Once encircled, a castle's fate hung on dwindling food stores, disease festering in cramped corridors, and the slow erosion of hope. Attackers knew this. They'd hurl dead animals over the walls to poison wells, or catapult severed heads to demoralize defenders. Yet for all the brutality, there was cunning too. Sappers dug tunnels to undermine walls, while defenders countered with boiling oil, hidden caltrops, or even fake surrenders to buy time. Every siege was a story of human ingenuity pushed to its darkest limits. And as we'll see next, the machines and tricks they devised would shape the very art of war for centuries to come. Castles weren't just stone and mortar. They were masterpieces of military engineering, designed to turn every attacker's advantage into a deadly trap. Picture a fortress like Beaumaris in Wales, its concentric walls forming a lethal puzzle. Even if an army breached the outer defenses, they'd find themselves trapped in a killing zone, exposed to arrows from higher inner walls. These weren't just buildings, they were death machines disguised as architecture. Thick curtain walls, sometimes up to 20 feet across, could shrug off battering rams for months. Moats, whether filled with water or sharpened stakes, forced enemies into choke points where murder holes in the ceilings let defenders rain down everything from rocks to boiling tar. Every corridor twisted to slow invaders, every staircase spiraled clockwise to hinder right-handed swordsmen, and even the windows were narrow slits, wide enough to fire arrows out but nearly impossible to shoot into. Location was just as critical as design. Perched atop hills or jutting into lakes, castles like Mont Saint-Michel in France exploited nature itself as a weapon. Attackers faced exhaustion climbing steep slopes before the real fight even began, while defenders enjoyed clear sightlines to pick off stragglers. Rivers and seas supplied fresh water during long sieges and could be dammed to flood approaches, turning the landscape against the enemy. And let's not forget the psychological warfare. Those towering walls weren't just physical barriers. They were symbols of dominance designed to crush morale before the first arrow flew. A well-placed castle could control entire regions without a single battle, its shadow stretching over villages like a warning. Yet even the strongest fortresses had their secrets. Hidden postern gates allowed surprise sorties or escape, while underground tunnels linked to distant forests for stealthy resupply. Some castles, like Crac des Chevaliers in Syria, boasted outer walls so vast they contained entire farms, enough to outlast years of siege. But the true genius lay in adaptability. As siege tactics evolved, so did castles. The invention of gunpowder didn't make them obsolete. Instead, architects thickened walls and angled bastions to deflect cannon fire. These weren't static monuments, but living fortresses, constantly reshaping the art of war itself. And as we'll see, the weapons built to crush them became equally ingenious, a deadly dance of innovation and destruction. The cruelest weapon in siege warfare wasn't the battering ram or the trebuchet, it was time. Armies knew that a well-executed blockade could break a city's spirit long before its walls crumbled. Picture a fortress surrounded by concentric rings of wooden palisades, trenches, and guard towers, sealing every possible escape route. These weren't just barriers, they were psychological torture devices, visible reminders to defenders that no help was coming. The Romans perfected this grim art with their circumvallation and contravallation walls, double-layered fortifications that trapped the besieged while shielding attackers from outside relief forces. Take Julius Caesar's masterpiece at Alesia in 52 BC. Facing a vast Gallic army holed up in a hilltop fortress, Caesar didn't just surround the stronghold. He built an 11-mile outer wall studded with watchtowers, pits filled with sharpened stakes, and even fields of spiked metal caltrops to cripple cavalry. When Gallic reinforcements arrived, they found themselves locked outside this second perimeter, unable to break through to their starving allies. It was a cage within a cage, a strategy so effective medieval commanders copied it for centuries. By the Middle Ages, blockade tactics had evolved into a deadly science. Siege lines often included purpose-built siege castles, small, fortified outposts to monitor supply routes. At the Siege of Kenilworth in 1266, royal forces encircled the rebel-held castle with floating barriers across the lake, while patrols intercepted smuggled food. Defenders resorted to eating horses, then dogs, then finally leather belts boiled into gruel. Meanwhile, attackers feasted in sight of the walls, taunting the desperate with the aroma of roasting meat. But starvation wasn't passive. Both sides played vicious mind games. Besiegers might allow a single farmer through with spoiled grain to spread disease, while defenders sent out emaciated prisoners to burden enemy supplies. The real terror lay in the uncertainty. No one knew how long reserves would last or who might crack first. For every city like Antioch, which held out for 8 months during the First Crusade, there were those like Rouen, where mothers reportedly threw their children over the walls, begging attackers for bread. These weren't just military maneuvers, they were calculated campaigns to erode humanity itself. And as we'll see, when starvation failed, siege engineers turned to machines that could tear the sky apart. Siege warfare wasn't just about breaking walls, it was about breaking minds. Commanders understood that fear could crumble stone faster than any battering ram, and they wielded psychological terror with chilling creativity. Imagine being a defender on castle walls when a severed head arcs over the battlements, your neighbor's face rotting and unrecognizable, thudding at your feet. The Mongols mastered this horror during their siege of Baghdad in 1258, catapulting decapitated enemy commanders into the city as a grotesque warning. Disease became another invisible soldier. In 1422, Hussite rebels hurled dead horses and plague-ridden corpses into Catholic strongholds, turning biology itself into a weapon. But psychological warfare wasn't always so visceral. Sometimes it played out in whispers and shadows. During the Siege of Tyre in 1187, Saladin's forces staged nightly phantom attacks, drums beating, torches swirling, to deprive crusaders of sleep until exhaustion blurred their resolve. Other commanders commissioned astrologers to predict doom for the defenders, spreading prophecies of inevitable defeat to erode morale from within. The soundscape of sieges was weaponized too. Trebuchets lobbed hollow clay pots filled with screaming prisoners to simulate the wails of the damned, while siege towers creaked forward draped in wet hides to smother Greek fire. The most insidious tricks exploited trust itself. In 1480, Spanish troops besieging Alhama disguised themselves as Moorish reinforcements, slipping through the gates before slaughtering the guards. Defenders retaliated with their own deceptions, staging fake surrenders to lure attackers into arrow range or spreading rumors of secret tunnels to send enemies digging fruitlessly for weeks. This was warfare where a well-timed lie could save thousands of lives, and where the real battle often happened not on the ramparts, but in the terrified minds of those trapped behind them. The lesson was clear. In siege warfare, the sharpest weapon was rarely a blade, it was the unbearable weight of dread, honed to perfection by masters of the dark art of fear. When walls stretched too high for ladders and gatehouses stood unbroken, siege towers became the ultimate game changers, colossal wooden beasts that rolled death right to a castle's doorstep. These weren't just scaffolds, they were multi-story war machines, some towering over 90 feet tall, crammed with armored soldiers and draped in fireproofed hides. The Romans called theirs the Helepolis, or taker of cities, a name that whispered doom to defenders watching it creep forward on hidden wheels. Medieval engineers refined the design into belfries, with drawbridges that could slam down onto enemy ramparts, turning a fortress's own walls into a highway for invasion. The Siege of Lisbon in 1147 showed their devastating potential. Crusaders, backed by English and German forces, constructed two massive siege towers under cover of darkness. As dawn broke, defenders gaped at these monstrous structures inching forward, protected by layers of soaked animal skins against flaming arrows. One tower collapsed under a hail of rocks, but the other reached the walls, unleashing a flood of knights directly into the heart of the battle. Lisbon fell that day, not because its walls failed, but because the towers made those walls irrelevant. Yet for all their power, siege towers were gambles. Their slow, groaning advance made them targets for everything from Greek fire to counter-siege mines. At the Siege of Acre in 1191, Saladin's forces ignited a Frankish belfry with naphtha, turning it into a towering pyre that roasted alive dozens of crusaders. Builders learned to shield them with iron plates or rotatable water tanks, but the trade-off was weight. Some became so heavy they sank into muddy terrain before ever reaching the walls. The real genius of these structures lay in their psychological impact. Imagine the horror of watching a creaking shadow blot out the sun, knowing it carried an army thirsting for blood. Some defenders surrendered at the mere sight of them rising in the distance. Others, like the Byzantines at Constantinople in 716, turned the tables by building their own towers taller, forcing attackers to abandon theirs mid-assault. Siege towers weren't just tools of war, they were symbols of ingenuity and terror, physical manifestations of an attacker's relentless will to conquer, no matter the cost. Forget everything you've seen in movies about battering rams. These weren't just mindless logs swung by grunting soldiers, but precision-engineered siege machines refined over centuries. The earliest versions were deceptively simple, a massive timber carried by teams of men, crashing rhythmically against gates until hinges screamed and bolts splintered. But by the medieval era, they'd evolved into wheeled behemoths, some housed within movable sheds called penthouse roofs that shielded attackers from arrows and boiling pitch. The Romans took it further with the testudo arietata, a reinforced tortoise shell structure that could roll right up to a gate while withstanding fire and rubble. Defenders countered with nightmarish ingenuity. At cracked des chevaliers, chains with hooked barbs dangled from murder holes, designed to snag rams mid-swing and render them useless. Others poured quicklime mixed with water, creating a searing paste that burned through wood and flesh alike. Some gates concealed deadly surprises, false portcullises that dropped to crush ram crews, or inner killing zones where defenders could trap and slaughter the entire assault team. The real terror came from above, cauldrons of boiling oil heated until they smoked, then tipped onto the ram's roof, seeping through cracks to melt skin from bone. Alexander the Great's siege of Tyre in 332 BC showcased the ram's devastating potential. Facing an island fortress thought unconquerable, he built a massive mole to reach its walls, then deployed armored rams on floating platforms. For 7 months, the rhythmic pounding echoed across the sea until Tyre's legendary walls, said to be built by the gods themselves, finally cracked. Yet even this victory came at a cost. The Tyrians lowered cages filled with blazing sand onto the rams, setting them ablaze and forcing Alexander's engineers to constantly improvise. The most advanced rams weren't just blunt instruments, they were works of art. Some featured ironclad heads shaped like snarling beasts, both to intimidate and to focus impact. Others used counterweight systems to increase striking force, while medieval variants sometimes mounted rotating chains to chew through gates like monstrous woodpeckers. But their true power lay in psychology. The steady, thunderous boom of a ram striking a gate wasn't just physical assault, it was a countdown to doom, each impact ratcheting terror inside the walls. For defenders, that sound meant only one thing: time was running out, and no wall, no matter how thick, could hold forever against humanity's oldest siege weapon, reborn again and again in the crucible of war. Beneath the thunder of siege engines and the clash of steel, a silent war raged in the darkness, a war of picks, shovels, and whispered betrayals. While armies clashed above ground, sappers toiled in cramped, airless tunnels, their work as deadly as any sword thrust. These weren't just diggers, they were the original combat engineers, turning soil into a weapon and earth itself into a battlefield. Their goal was simple: carve beneath a castle's foundations, prop the tunnel with wooden supports, then set them ablaze. As the timbers burned away, the walls above would groan, crack, and finally collapse in a cloud of dust and screams. But defenders weren't passive victims. They listened for the telltale scrape of tools underground and dug their own countermines, leading to horrifying clashes in pitch-black passages where men fought with daggers and spades, their only light the flicker of a dying torch. The Siege of Rochester in 1215 became the stuff of legend when King John's forces targeted the rebel-held castle's mighty keep. For weeks, his sappers chipped away beneath the southeast tower, their progress hidden by a relentless barrage of stones from trebuchets. The defenders, sensing the danger, dug frantically to intercept them. What followed was medieval warfare at its most intimate, a knife fight in a crawl space where victory went to those who could strike first in the suffocating dark. When John's men finally ignited their pit props, the entire corner of the keep crumbled, yet the rebels retreated to the intact section, fighting on for days until starvation forced their surrender. Countermining wasn't just about brute force, it was a game of acoustic espionage. Defenders placed drums of water along floors to detect vibrations or lowered experienced miners on ropes to press their ears against stone, listening for the enemy's rhythm. Some castles, like Dover, had built-in listening galleries, hollow chambers in the walls where sentries could hear tunneling long before it threatened the foundations. The Byzantines took it further, using giant copper plates as primitive amplifiers to pinpoint digging with eerie precision. But the most chilling tactic of all was the mine kill. When opposing tunnels collided, attackers might flood the passage with noxious smoke, or worse, ignite barrels of combustible materials, creating a firestorm that sucked the air from lungs and left enemies as charred husks in the earth. At the siege of Kaffa in 1346, the Mongols allegedly hurled plague-ridden corpses into Genos tunnels, turning them into biological death traps. This was warfare stripped to its rawest form. No glory, no chivalry, just men clawing at dirt in the dark, knowing the next shovel strike could bring the ceiling down on their heads. And as we'll see, even these subterranean horrors were just one piece of a far deadlier puzzle. Amidst the clang of swords and crash of rams, one weapon inspired pure, unthinking terror. A liquid hellfire that clung to skin, devoured ships, and burned even on waves. The Byzantines called it Greek fire, though its true name and recipe vanished with the empire that wielded it. Picture a medieval naval battle at night. Enemy galleys approach Constantinople's walls, only for bronze tubes mounted on Byzantine ships to spew jets of roaring flame, igniting sails and men alike. Victims plunged into the sea to find the water itself aflame, the fire chasing them beneath the surface like some angry elemental spirit. This wasn't just fire, it was alchemy weaponized, a closely guarded state secret carried to the grave by generations of emperors and chemists. The invention likely emerged in the 7th century when Constantinople stood as a lone Christian bastion against advancing Islamic fleets. According to chronicles, a Syrian engineer named Kallinikos fled to the city with the recipe, though even this may be myth. What's certain is that Greek fire's deployment at sea changed warfare forever. Byzantine Droman warships mounted pressurized siphons, early flamethrowers that could project the substance over 100 feet, dousing entire decks in sticky, inextinguishable flames. Worse still, it defied conventional defenses. Sand smothered ordinary fires, but Greek fire reportedly burned hotter when buried. Water only spread it. Some accounts claim it ignited spontaneously upon contact with air, while others describe its fumes choking men before the flames ever touched them. Europe developed its own twisted variants, like the infamous wildfire described in medieval chronicles. A volatile mix likely containing naphtha, sulfur, and quicklime that could ignite stone itself. During the siege of Damietta in 1218, Crusaders hurled pots of wildfire onto Muslim ships, creating infernos so intense they melted metal fittings. Yet none matched Greek fire's horrifying efficiency. Its secrecy became legendary. Byzantine emperors allegedly confined the chemists who knew its formula to isolated palaces, splitting the recipe between families so no single person possessed the full knowledge. When enemies captured siphons, they proved useless without the precise mixture. Too thin, and it wouldn't ignite; too thick, and it clogged the tubes catastrophically. Modern historians still debate its composition. Napalm-like petroleum bases seem likely, mixed with pine resin for adhesion and saltpeter for explosive ignition. Some theories suggest quicklime's reaction with water sustained burning even underwater, while others propose hidden ingredients like phosphorus. The truth died with Constantinople's fall in 1453, leaving only charred accounts of its horrors. But its legacy endured not just as a weapon, but as a warning of war's darkest ingenuity, where science and savagery merged into something neither fully understood nor ever truly controlled. Nothing struck fear into medieval defenders like the whistling arc of a trebuchet projectile, a sound that meant death could drop from the sky at any moment. These weren't mere catapults, they were physics perfected for destruction, capable of hurling a 300-pound boulder over 800 feet with terrifying precision. The secret lay in their counterweight system, a massive wooden arm pivoting on an axle with a sling at one end and a box filled with tons of stones or lead at the other. When released, the counterweight dropped, whipping the arm upward with enough force to launch projectiles at speeds surpassing 100 miles per hour. Unlike earlier traction trebuchets powered by teams of men yanking ropes, counterweight versions didn't rely on human strength, allowing for consistency and scale that reshaped siege warfare. The difference between the two designs was night and day. Traction trebuchets used since ancient China required dozens of pullers working in unison, limiting projectile weight and range. But by the 12th century, Crusaders encountered Islamic counterweight trebuchets like the fearsome manjanik at Acre, machines so powerful they could reduce castle towers to rubble in days. European engineers quickly adopted and refined the design, culminating in monsters like Warwolf, built for Edward Longshanks during the siege of Stirling Castle in 1304. Legend claims it took 30 wagons to transport its parts, and when assembled, its first shot smashed through the castle's curtain wall like paper. Yet trebuchets weren't just for stone. Commanders turned them into instruments of psychological and biological warfare. At Kaffa in 1346, Mongol forces reportedly lobbed plague-ridden corpses over the walls, possibly triggering the Black Death spread into Europe. Other sieges saw rotting livestock hurled to poison wells or beehives launched to sow chaos among defenders. Some creative attackers even used them to fling severed heads or prisoners, a grisly messaging system meant to break morale. Precision mattered as much as power. Engineers adjusted sling lengths and counterweight sizes for different targets, shorter throws for dense walls, higher arcs for interior structures. At the Siege of Toulouse in 1218, a well-placed shot smashed through a chapel roof, killing the defending count during prayer. Defenders retaliated by padding walls with timber or hanging curtains of damp hides to absorb impacts, but against a perfectly balanced trebuchet, even these measures often failed. The true genius of these machines wasn't just their brute force, it was their ability to turn gravity itself into a weapon, harnessing simple mechanics to rewrite the rules of war. And as we'll see, their legacy endured long after gunpowder arrived, proving that sometimes the old ways hit hardest. While trebuchets relied on gravity, another breed of siege engine harnessed twisted ropes to unleash havoc, torsion-powered catapults like the Roman onager. Picture a massive wooden frame with a single horizontal arm wound tight like a coiled spring, its energy stored in twisted sinew ropes. When released, the arm snapped forward with violent force, launching anything from stones to clay pots of flaming pitch. Unlike trebuchets' arcing shots, onagers fired in a flatter trajectory, perfect for smashing through specific wall sections or clearing battlements of defenders. The recoil was so brutal the machine earned its name, onager, meaning wild donkey, for its tendency to kick backward like a beast bucking its rider. Mangonels took this principle further, adding a pivoting arm and sling to increase range and power. These weren't just scaled-up onagers, they were precision instruments capable of adjusting shot angles to target weak points in a fortress's defenses. At the Siege of Acre in 1191 during the Third Crusade, mangonels played a starring role. Richard the Lionheart's forces deployed them to pummel the city's coastal walls, their stones striking with such force that chroniclers claimed the impact shook ships anchored half a mile away. Meanwhile, Muslim defenders answered with their own mangonels, creating a deadly artillery duel across the rubble-strewn no-man's land. What set these machines apart was their versatility. While trebuchets excelled at demolition, torsion catapults offered rapid-fire terror. Some crews loaded grape-shot clusters of smaller stones to shred enemy formations, while others hurled rotting carcasses or beehives to sow chaos. The Romans even used onagers to launch surprise attacks. At the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD, they reportedly shot incendiary projectiles wrapped in oily rags, igniting rooftops behind the city's inner walls. Yet their power came at a cost. Twisted sinew ropes, often made from animal tendons, were sensitive to humidity. A sudden rainstorm could loosen them, rendering the weapon useless until painstakingly rewound. And unlike trebuchets, which could be calibrated with mathematical precision, torsion catapults required an artful touch. Too much tension and the ropes snapped, too little and the shot fell pitifully short. Master gunners guarded their tuning secrets closely, knowing a well-adjusted mangonel could mean the difference between a futile barrage and a wall crumbling at dawn's first light. The real brilliance of these machines lay in their adaptability. While trebuchets dominated open sieges, torsion catapults thrived in tight spaces, forests, hillsides, even ship decks where their compact frames allowed deployment where larger engines couldn't go. At the Siege of Tyre in 1187, Crusaders mounted mangonels on barges, creating floating batteries that bombarded the island city from multiple angles. Defenders countered by lining their walls with shock-absorbing bundles of wool or straw, but against a relentless barrage, even these measures faltered. In the end, whether it was the onager's brutal simplicity or the mangonel's refined fury, torsion power proved one thing. In siege warfare, innovation wasn't just about size, it was about finding the right tool to exploit an enemy's every weakness. The most horrifying weapon in siege warfare required no steel, fire, or brute force, just patience and the invisible hand of nature itself. Biological warfare turned sickness into strategy, where a single contaminated well or a rain of plague-ridden corpses could doom a city faster than any army. Medieval commanders understood that disease didn't discriminate. It could topple kings, cripple garrisons, and unravel societies from within. At the siege of Thunveil in 1340, attackers catapulted decomposing animals into the fortress, knowing the stench alone would weaken morale, while the real threat festered in contaminated water supplies. But the most infamous case emerged at Kaffa in 1346, where the Mongol Golden Horde, decimated by the Black Death, allegedly hurled infected bodies over Genos walls. Contemporary accounts describe defenders choking on the stench of rotting corpses piling in their streets, a grotesque delivery system for a pandemic that would soon ravage Europe. Poisoning wells became another calculated cruelty. Besiegers dumped animal carcasses or toxic plants like hellebore into freshwater sources, turning life's basic necessity into a slow-acting weapon. During the Siege of Naples in 1495, French forces spiked wells with a mixture of arsenic and quicklime, causing agonizing deaths that spread panic more effectively than any assault. Defenders countered by posting armed guards at cisterns or digging secret underground channels, but desperation often led to drinking tainted water anyway. Some sieges saw attackers deliberately leave behind contaminated food, barrels of grain laced with ergot fungus, or wine tainted with belladonna, knowing hungry defenders would risk poisoning over starvation. What's chilling is how these tactics sparked ethical debates even in an era of unquestioned brutality. Chroniclers like Gabriel de Mussy, who recorded the Siege of Kaffa, wrestled with the morality of weaponizing disease, calling it a cruelty surpassing all bounds of war. Religious leaders condemned the practice, with Pope Innocent Roman III declaring poisoned wells an offense against God's creation. Yet the pragmatism of survival often overrode scruples. When the Teutonic Knights besieged Vilnius in 1390, they justified catapulting dead horses as divine punishment for paganism. The line between strategy and sacrilege blurred. Where did honorable warfare end and abomination begin? The answer, it seemed, depended on who was holding the quill when history was written. The legacy of medieval biological warfare lingers in unsettling ways. Modern historians still debate whether Kaffa truly triggered the Black Death spread or simply became a scapegoat for a pandemic already coursing through trade routes. But the broader lesson remains: sieges weren't just tests of strength, but of humanity's darkest ingenuity. When starvation and steel failed, commanders reached for an older, more insidious weapon. The silent, patient power of nature itself turned against those who dared to hide behind walls. And as we'll see, even these horrors were just one thread in the tapestry of medieval siegecraft's relentless evolution. While siege engines and sappers worked their destruction from afar and below, another deadly force patrolled the battlefield: archers and crossbowmen, turning the sky into a lethal net of arrows and bolts. These weren't just supporting players, they were the puppeteers of siege warfare, controlling every movement on the walls. Picture a rain of arrows so thick it blotted out the sun, forcing defenders to cower behind shields while sappers inched closer to the walls or siege towers rolled into position. A single well-placed shot from a skilled longbowman could change the course of a siege, sniping a commander through a murder hole or pinning a defender's hand to the timber they were trying to defend. Longbows and crossbows brought different nightmares to besieged garrisons. The English longbow, standing over 6 feet tall, could launch arrows at rates of up to 12 per minute in skilled hands, creating a hailstorm of projectiles that overwhelmed defenders through sheer volume. Made from resilient yew wood, these bows could drive an arrow clean through plate armor at 200 yards, turning even heavily armored knights into vulnerable targets. But the crossbow, though slower to reload, packed terrifying precision and punch. Its steel prod and mechanical trigger allowed even minimally trained soldiers to deliver armor-splitting bolts with enough force to pierce oak doors or embed themselves in stone walls. The Siege of Harfleur in 1415 showcased this deadly duality. Henry V's English forces, laden with longbowmen, blanketed the French-held town in arrows, suppressing return fire while sappers undermined the walls. French crossbowmen, positioned in the towers, retaliated with measured, lethal shots, picking off exposed attackers with methodical efficiency. The difference in tactics was stark. English volleys created chaos, while French bolts delivered targeted terror. Both, however, shared the same grim purpose: to turn the open ground between siege lines and walls into a killing field where no one stood safely. What made these ranged troops indispensable was their adaptability. Archers didn't just shoot blindly, they targeted weak points. At Harfleur, they aimed for the hinges of gates, the ropes holding drawbridges, or the islets of helmets. Others launched fire arrows to ignite thatched roofs inside the walls, spreading panic as smoke choked the streets. Crossbowmen, meanwhile, specialized in psychological warfare. Their audible click and sudden thud of a bolt striking wood kept defenders from daring to peek over battlements. Some besiegers even used whistling arrows, their eerie shrieks designed to unnerve enemies before the first casualty fell. Defenders countered with ingenuity of their own. Castle designs evolved to minimize exposure. Arrow loops narrowed to slits, offering protection while allowing return shots. Some garrisons hung thick woolen curtains to absorb arrows, while others deployed portable wooden mantlets to shield their own archers. The real terror came when defenders turned attackers' weapons against them. At the Siege of Stirling Castle in 1304, Scottish forces reportedly gathered thousands of English arrows during lulls, firing them back with added messages tied to the shafts, sometimes mere taunts, other times promises of no mercy. The legacy of these ranged warriors extends beyond medieval warfare. Their tactics, suppressive fire, precision strikes, psychological pressure became the blueprint for modern combat. But in their time, they were the unseen architects of siege strategy, proving that sometimes the deadliest threats weren't the ones that shook the earth or shattered walls, but those that rode silently on the wind, striking before their victims even heard the twang of the bowstring. When walls finally cracked and gates gave way, the real horror began the moment when knights and men-at-arms surged forward into the kill zone. This wasn't battle as poets romanticized it. This was butchery in tight corridors, where swords grew dull from striking bone and the air reeked of blood and burning pitch. The first wave through a breach carried more than weapons. They hauled wooden planks to bridge collapsed masonry, hooked ropes to scale rubble, and wore padded gambesons soaked in vinegar to resist the inevitable splash of boiling oil. Those who survived the initial sprint faced a maze of death, murder holes dripping fire from above, pits disguised as stable floors, and defenders wielding polearms designed to hook limbs and drag armored men into the dirt. Close-quarters siege combat favored the ruthless, while knights in open battles prized honor and single combat. Storming a fortress meant fighting back-to-back in stairwells so narrow a single axe swing could clear them. The Siege of Lincoln in 1217 showed this savagery in sharp relief when William Marshall, then 70 years old, led the charge through a shattered gate. Witnesses described him fighting like a man half his age, his mace crushing skulls through helmets as his men formed a wedge behind him, their advance measured in inches and corpses. What made such assaults possible wasn't just courage, it was specialized gear. Grappling hooks with silk ropes for stealthy night climbs, folding ladders with iron tips to bite into stone, even portable shields called pavises that archers could crouch behind while reloading. Yet for every successful escalade, there were failures written in rivers of blood. At the siege of Château-Gaillard in 1204, French attackers tried rushing a supposedly undefended latrine chute, only to find the passage blocked by a single armored knight standing waist-deep in filth, his sword cutting down men as they crawled toward him one by one. Other garrisons played psychological games, dressing corpses in captured armor and propping them on walls to lure attackers into ambushes, or tolling funeral bells during assaults to demoralize. The true cost of these assaults emerged in aftermaths. Chroniclers described streets slick with so much gore that survivors slipped in it, or siege tunnels excavated not by tools but by the sheer weight of piled bodies. Knights who survived became legends, their deeds immortalized not because they fought cleanly, but because they endured the unimaginable, a world reduced to darkness, screaming, and the metallic taste of blood in the air. And as we'll see, even these nightmare scenarios paled beside the final, unthinkable act of a desperate fortress, the moment when defenders decided no one would leave alive. When we picture medieval sieges, it's easy to imagine armored knights and towering war machines, but the hidden backbone of every besieged fortress was often its women and children. Far from passive victims, they became engineers, medics, and even warriors when the walls trembled. Young boys darted along battlements with buckets of water to douse fires, while girls and elderly women stitched torn gambesons and forged arrows in makeshift workshops. The most perilous duty fell to those who manned the cauldrons, standing for hours over boiling oil or molten lead, ready to pour death on attackers scaling the walls. At Château de Coucy in 1415, chroniclers recorded how children as young as 8 formed chains to pass stones to archers, their small hands bleeding from the rough edges. This wasn't just survival, it was total war where every pair of hands mattered. The Siege of Béziers in 1209 revealed the horror awaiting civilians when defenses failed. As Crusader forces stormed the Occitan town, a commander famously declared, "Kill them all, God will know his own." What followed was a massacre so thorough that streets ran red with the blood of 20,000 souls, knights, merchants, even nuns clutching altar cloths. Women hiding in churches were burned alive when attackers set the rooftops ablaze, while children who fled to the river were cut down by cavalry waiting on the banks. Such brutality wasn't exceptional, it was policy. Sacking served as psychological warfare, a warning to other cities, surrender or share this fate. Yet amidst the darkness, astonishing stories of defiance emerged. At Lincoln Castle in 1216, 70-year-old Nicolas de la Haye commanded the garrison against French invaders for 3 months, directing repairs and rationing supplies with the precision of a seasoned general. Her leadership was so formidable that King John later appointed her Sheriff of Lincolnshire, an unheard-of role for a medieval woman. Similarly, during the Siege of Montségur in 1244, Cathar women allegedly hurled rocks and lit torches to repel night assaults after the men grew too exhausted to stand. These weren't anomalies but erased chapters of history where the line between combatant and survivor blurred beyond recognition, the cruelest irony. While noblewomen like Nicola were celebrated, commoners faced grim double standards. After the siege of Limoges in 1370, chronicler Froissart lamented the death of fair ladies, but glossed over hundreds of peasant women crushed in collapsed tunnels. Survival often hinged on class. Wealthy families might bribe their way out or be held for ransom, while the poor faced slaughter or slavery. Some women resorted to desperate acts. At Carcassonne in 1209, defenders allegedly pushed captive women onto siege ladders to unbalance them, knowing attackers wouldn't strike their own. What these stories reveal is a truth far messier than myths of chivalry. Sieges didn't spare the innocent, they weaponized them. Whether boiling oil or broken bodies, every life became a tool or a target. And in that unrelenting calculus, the forgotten heroines of medieval warfare wrote their own epitaphs, not in ink, but in blood, fire, and defiance. The thunder of siege engines and the stench of burning pitch often masked a quieter, deadlier game, the delicate dance of negotiation. For every castle that fell to brute force, another saw its gates open through whispered deals, where the threat of starvation proved sharper than any sword. Surrender wasn't shame, it was survival, codified in rituals as precise as they were symbolic. When a garrison yielded honorably, commanders would exchange keys to the city gates, not just handing over metal, but acknowledging the transfer of authority. Hostages, often noble children, were given as collateral to ensure terms were kept, their lives a silent guarantee against betrayal. At the Siege of Calais in 1347, 6 burghers famously emerged barefoot with ropes around their necks, offering their lives in exchange for the town's mercy, a gesture so stark it moved even the hardened Edward III to spare the citizens. But not all surrenders were created equal. The line between honorable terms and outright treachery could vanish in a blink. Take the massacre at Limoges in 1370, where the Black Prince, once a paragon of chivalry, ordered the slaughter of 3,000 civilians despite their surrender. Chroniclers claimed the streets ran red as his men ignored pleas for mercy, hacking down women and children alongside soldiers. The reason? A perceived betrayal. The town had briefly switched allegiance to the French, and the prince's retribution was meant to echo across Aquitaine as a warning. Contrast this with the Siege of Stirling in 1304, where the Scottish defenders, starving and outnumbered, negotiated safe passage in exchange for peacefully yielding the castle, an agreement Edward Longshanks honored, albeit grudgingly. The art of siege diplomacy hinged on leverage and perception. Defenders might feign strength, parading well-fed troops on the walls while their children scavenged for rats in the cellars. Attackers, meanwhile, bluffed with hollow threats or staged mock assaults to disguise their own dwindling supplies. At Acre in 1191, Richard the Lionheart and Saladin traded prisoners and promises through intermediaries, each trying to outmaneuver the other without losing face. Broken terms carried consequences beyond reputation. Future sieges grew bloodier as defenders learned to fight to the death rather than risk a liar's mercy. Some surrenders became spectacles of cold calculation. When Barcelona capitulated to Franco-Castilian forces in 1476, the terms included not just keys and hostages, but a humiliating clause. The city's leaders had to kneel bareheaded in the snow for hours before the victor's tent. Yet even this was preferable to the alternative. Sacking meant rape, enslavement, and generational ruin. In the end, siege diplomacy revealed war's hardest truth. Sometimes the greatest power lay not in breaking walls, but in knowing when to lay down the sword. And for those who mastered this dance, survival became the quietest victory of all. Faith didn't just inspire medieval sieges, it weaponized them, turning stone walls into battlegrounds for divine judgment. When Crusader forces reached Jerusalem in 1099, this wasn't mere conquest, it was a holy reckoning. Priests marched alongside knights, swinging censers that trailed smoke over siege engines, while relic-encrusted banners flapped above trenches filled with praying soldiers. The siege's climax came when a mystic claimed to see the ghostly figure of St. George leading the charge, a vision so potent it sent waves of frenzied attackers scrambling over ladders, convinced God himself shielded them from arrows. Similar fervor fueled the Albigensian Crusade in 13th century France, where the Catholic Church declared entire cities heretical and justified their reduction to rubble. At Béziers, when a commander asked how to distinguish faithful from Cathar rebels, the chilling reply came, "Kill them all. God will know his own." Religious orders like the Templars and Hospitallers elevated siegecraft to an art form, blending monastic discipline with battlefield brutality. These warrior monks weren't just fighters, they were engineers who prayed over blueprints, constructing mobile siege towers with chapel-like shrines built into their upper levels. During the Siege of Acre in 1191, Templar sappers tunneled beneath Muslim walls while chaplains behind the lines chanted psalms, timing their verses to the rhythm of pickaxes. The Hospitallers went further, turning their infirmaries into siege workshops using sanctified oil to treat wounds by day and fuel firebombs by night. Their greatest weapon, morale, a knight charging under the banner of the true cross fought with terrifying certainty that death meant martyrdom. Miracles, real or staged, became psychological artillery. At Antioch in 1098, starving crusaders unearthed the Holy Lance, said to have pierced Christ's side. The discovery sparked euphoric charges against impossible odds, though skeptics later whispered it was planted by a crafty priest. Similarly, Ottoman forces besieging Constantinople in 1453 flew the Prophet Muhammad's banner, while inside the walls, priests paraded the Virgin Mary's robe through streets slick with panic. Both sides knew faith could stiffen spines or shatter them. When Saladin retook Jerusalem in 1187, he ordered the city's sacred relics displayed atop the walls, not as trophies, but as a message that divine favor had shifted. The darkest irony lay in the relics themselves. Fragments of saints' bones, vials of martyrs' blood, even splinters of the true cross were carried into battle like spiritual artillery. At the Siege of Lisbon in 1147, Crusaders launched stones wrapped in parchment inscribed with prayers, believing holy words could shatter pagan walls. Defenders countered with their own sacred theater. Muslim garrisons recited the Quran through megaphones to drown out Christian hymns, while Jewish communities in Spain hung Torah scrolls from battlements, trusting scripture to shield them from catapults. In holy wars, surrender terms carried eternal stakes. Templars executing prisoners at Gaza in 1244 claimed they spared infidels from damnation by denying them time to repent. Conversely, Saladin's mercy after capturing Jerusalem, allowing Christians to leave peacefully if they paid a ransom, wasn't just chivalry. It was strategic piety, earning him praise even in enemy chronicles. These sieges blurred the line between battlefield and altar, where every shattered gate seemed proof of divine will, and every fallen defender became either a martyr or a heretic, depending on who wrote the history. The true cost was measured not just in blood, but in the certainty that God watched and took sides. Water added a terrifying dimension to medieval siege warfare, where castles could be starved not just by land, but by the silent stranglehold of naval blockades. Picture the Venetian fleet encircling Tyre in 1124, their galleys transformed into floating fortresses, each armed with mangonels that hurled firepots onto the city's seawalls. Unlike land sieges where defenders could sneak supplies through hidden tunnels, a well-executed maritime blockade meant utter isolation. Harbor chains' massive iron links stretched between towers became the last line of defense, as seen at Constantinople, where the Byzantines could lift their chain boom to seal the Golden Horn against entire armadas. But even these barriers had weaknesses. At Damietta in 1218, Crusaders faced a colossal chain blocking the Nile until they devised a brutal workaround: fire ships. Crewless vessels packed with pitch and sulfur were set adrift, their flames licking the iron until it glowed red and snapped under its own weight. The real terror of naval sieges lay in their three-dimensional brutality. Attackers didn't just approach from one direction, they struck from below with divers sabotaging hulls, from above with archers perched in crow's nests, and from all sides with ships lashed together to form floating siege platforms. The generals perfected this at the Siege of Chioggia in 1380, using anchored carracks as stationary artillery platforms, their decks crammed with trebuchets that pummeled the Venetian harbor defenses. Meanwhile, smaller boats darted through the shallows, cutting fishing nets and poisoning oyster beds to tighten the noose of starvation. Defenders retaliated with underwater stakes to impale landing craft or Greek fire siphons mounted on barges, turning the water's surface into a burning hellscape. Perhaps the most chilling naval siege tactic was the floating plague. During the Siege of Kaffa, besiegers didn't just hurl infected corpses over walls. They lashed them to driftwood and tide washed them into the harbor, where lapping waves carried pestilence into every cranny of the city. Even surrender at sea carried unique horrors. Unlike land garrisons who might negotiate safe passage, sailors' new capture often meant being thrown overboard with hands bound. The sea, after all, never ran out of room for the dead. And as the wreckage of countless sieges proved, a city's fate could hinge not on its walls, but on whose fleet controlled the waves beyond them. Constantinople in 1453 wasn't just a city under siege. It was the last flickering candle of an empire, its ancient walls trembling beneath the thunder of something new: gunpowder. For 53 days, the Ottomans under Mehmed II unleashed hell itself, their cannons blasting holes in defenses that had stood impregnable for 1,000 years. But this was no ordinary bombardment. Mehmed's secret weapon was the basilica, a monstrous bombard cast in bronze, 27 feet long and capable of hurling 1,500-pound stones over a mile. Each shot took 3 hours to reload, and the recoil was so violent the gun had to be braced with earthworks between firings. Yet when those projectiles struck, they didn't just chip at Theodosian walls, they vaporized entire sections, reducing Byzantine pride to rubble. The Byzantines, led by Emperor Constantine XI, countered with desperate ingenuity. By night, crews scrambled to repair breaches with wooden palisades and barrels of dirt, while Greek fire arced from the seawalls, setting Ottoman siege towers ablaze. Even Mehmed's elite janissaries, storming the broken defenses, found themselves battling not just men but ghost descendants of the Roman legions fighting with the ferocity of a dying breed. The real turning point came when the Ottomans discovered an unguarded postern gate, its hinges left unlocked by sheer exhaustion or betrayal. As dawn broke on May 29th, the city's fate was sealed in blood and smoke. Constantine, refusing to flee, tore off his imperial insignia and charged into the melee, vanishing into legend. What made this siege revolutionary wasn't just the cannons, it was the orchestration of medieval and modern tactics. Mehmed dragged 70 ships overland on greased logs to bypass the harbor chain, while Byzantine defenders tunneled beneath Ottoman lines to plant explosives. The fall of Constantinople didn't just mark the end of an empire, it heralded the death of medieval warfare itself. Stone castles, the backbone of defense for centuries, became obsolete overnight. The age of gunpowder had arrived, and with it, a new era where walls could no longer guarantee safety. The echoes of those final explosions didn't just shake Constantinople. They reverberated across Europe, a chilling warning that the rules of war had changed forever. Cannons didn't just change warfare, they shattered an entire era. The first crude bombards emerging in the 14th century were unpredictable beasts, prone to exploding as often as they fired. But by the Siege of Orleans in 1429, these iron monsters had evolved into instruments of terror. When French gunners wheeled their bombards into position, the sheer concussion of their shots sent tremors through the English defenders' bones. Stone walls that had shrugged off trebuchets for centuries crumbled like stale bread under the relentless pounding. Unlike siege engines that lobbed projectiles in graceful arcs, cannons delivered violence in a straight line, a brutal physics lesson that made medieval fortifications obsolete overnight. The secret lay in sheer kinetic force. Early bombards like the Mons Meg, capable of hurling 400-pound stones, didn't just breach gates, they disintegrated entire sections of curtain wall in a single shot. But raw power came with drawbacks. These behemoths took hours to reload, required teams of oxen to move, and often cracked after a few dozen firings. By the late 15th century, sleeker designs like the culverin emerged, longer barrels for precision, forged from tougher alloys to withstand repeated use. At the siege of Constantinople, Maime's bombard crews had to pack their guns with wet cloth between shots to prevent overheating, while Swiss mercenaries at Nancy in 1477 fielded mobile cart cannons that could reposition mid-battle, foreshadowing modern artillery tactics. Fortress architects scrambled to adapt. The answer, the Tres Italian star-shaped forts with low, sloping walls designed to absorb cannon shots rather than resist them. These geometric marvels, like Pomonova in Italy, replaced towering stone with angled bastions that gave defending gunners overlapping fields of fire. Where medieval castles relied on height, these forts embraced sprawl, forcing attackers into deadly crossfire zones. The shift wasn't just structural, it was philosophical. Warfare no longer favored the patient defender behind impenetrable walls, but the aggressor who could bring the heaviest guns to bear fastest. Yet cannons didn't just dominate sieges, they democratized them. Where once only kings could afford months-long blockades, now any mercenary company with a few culverins could reduce a lord's pride to rubble. At the siege of Harfleur in 1415, Henry V's artillery tore through the walls in weeks, not months. The message was clear: in the age of gunpowder, no castle was sacred and no dynasty safe behind stone. The echoing booms of those early cannons weren't just breaking walls, they were heralding the birth of a new, more brutal era of warfare. Behind every great siege was a mind that bent physics to its will. Men like Archimedes of Syracuse, who turned his city's walls into a nightmare of innovation. When the Roman fleet arrived in 214 BC, they didn't face mere soldiers, they faced a genius who'd weaponized science itself. Ancient writers claimed Archimedes designed massive clawed cranes to pluck ships from the sea and drop them, splintering hulls like kindling. His legendary death ray, though debated by historians, might have been an array of polished bronze shields focusing sunlight into a burning beam, an ancient laser harrowing invaders. But his most enduring contribution was the endless screw, a device still used today which allowed defenders to rapidly drain or flood tunnels during underground assaults. Syracuse held out for 2 years against Rome's finest, not through brute force, but because one man outthought an empire. Centuries later, Villard de Honnecourt sketched siege engines that blurred the line between art and annihilation. This 13th century French architect's notebook reads like a medieval blueprint for destruction: trebuchets with counterweights calibrated to the ounce, portable bridges that unfolded like origami, and even early concepts for perpetual motion machines. Though some designs were fanciful, others, like his torsion-powered mangonel, saw real battlefield use. Villard understood that siegecraft wasn't just about power but precision. His adjustable trebuchet slings could vary trajectory on the fly, allowing gunners to walk their shots onto vulnerable gatehouses with terrifying accuracy. Then there's the tantalizing what-if of Leonardo da Vinci's unbuilt war machines. Though he never saw a siege, his notebooks overflowed with concepts centuries ahead of their time. His revolving bridge, designed for the Duke of Milan, could swing across moats like a drawbridge but pivot to cut off pursuers. More chilling was his triple-tiered cannon carriage, a proto-tank that placed rapid-firing guns behind angled shields. But Leonardo's most ingenious design might have been his musical landmines, hollow spheres filled with shrapnel and gunpowder, rigged to detonate when enemy carts passed over hidden triggers. These inventors shared a common thread. They saw sieges not as clashes of strength, but as puzzles waiting for the right mind to solve them. Whether it was Archimedes turning sunlight into a weapon or Villard calculating the perfect counterweight ratio, their legacies remind us that in the calculus of war, creativity often outlasts brute force. And while some designs lived only on parchment, their very existence pushed the boundaries of what medieval warfare could be, proving that sometimes the sharpest blade was a well-sharpened intellect. For every legendary siege that shattered empires, there were disastrous failures where attackers learned the hard way that walls and wills could defy even the mightiest armies. Take the English catastrophe at Berwick in 1319, a campaign so poorly planned it became a masterclass in how not to conduct a siege. King Edward II's forces, confident after earlier victories, surrounded the Scottish stronghold but neglected to fully blockade the harbour. Scottish supply ships slipped past nightly, while dysentery ripped through English ranks from latrines dug too close to cooking trenches. After months of futile assaults, Edward's demoralized army retreated, leaving behind smoldering siege engines and a lesson etched in blood. Arrogance and disease could topple kings as surely as any trebuchet. Half a world away, the Mongols faced their own reckoning at Ain Jalut in 1260. The invincible horde, accustomed to sweeping across continents, underestimated both the desert heat and the Mamluk defenders' guerrilla tactics. When the Mongols' usual feigned retreat failed to bait the enemy, their horses, exhausted and dehydrated, became liabilities rather than assets. The Mamluks, leveraging local knowledge of hidden springs, lured the invaders into a killing zone where their famed mobility meant nothing. It was the first time the Mongols tasted total defeat, proving even history's most terrifying war machine could crumble when terrain and timing turned against them. Weather alone could unravel the best-laid siege plans. The Nazi assault on Leningrad during World War II mirrored medieval horrors when winter became the deadliest defender. German forces, expecting a quick victory, found themselves trapped by freezing temperatures that disabled tanks, froze fuel, and turned supply lines into icy graveyards. Soldiers starved in their trenches as temperatures plunged to -40. Their medieval predecessors' suffering repeated on a mechanized scale. The siege dragged on for 900 days, ultimately failing not because of Soviet counterattacks, but because the attackers failed to respect the oldest enemy of all, nature itself. The thread connecting these disasters, underestimating the defenders' resolve. At Malta in 1565, the Ottomans outnumbered the Knights Hospitaller 20-1, yet faltered when their bombardment failed to break the Knights' makeshift repairs. Each night, Maltese women and children hauled rubble to plug breaches, while raiding parties torched Ottoman siegeworks. By the time the Sultan's commanders realized their numerical advantage meant nothing against ingenuity, dysentery and dehydration had crippled their ranks. Sieges weren't just tests of strength, they were battles of adaptation where the side slower to learn inevitably paid the steepest price. Whether it was Edward ignoring basic sanitation or the Mongols dismissing desert warfare's rules, history's greatest siege failures shared one truth: no army, no matter how powerful, could conquer its own complacency. Hollywood loves a good siege, the flaming arrows, the crumbling walls, the heroic last stands. But how often does the spectacle match reality? Take the infamous Battle of the Blackwater from Game of Thrones, where wildfire obliterates an entire fleet in seconds. While the visual is stunning, medieval sieges rarely featured such instant annihilation. Real wildfire or Greek fire was terrifying, but it didn't explode like modern gasoline. It clung and burned, a slower, stickier horror. Similarly, those endless volleys of arrows raining down in movies are pure fantasy. a longbowman might carry 24 arrows at most, and each shot took skill and stamina. The idea of unlimited ammo is as mythical as dragons. Then there's the myth of the instant wall breach. Films often show trebuchets or battering rams smashing through fortifications in minutes, but history tells a different story. At the Siege of Harfleur, Henry V's cannon pounded the walls for weeks before creating a manageable gap. Even then, defenders would patch breaches overnight with timber and rubble. Game of Thrones' Battle of Castle Black gets this half right. The giants and mammoths are pure fantasy, but the slow, grinding exhaustion of the defenders. That's textbook medieval siege fatigue, but it's not all Hollywood exaggeration. Some productions nail the details. HBO's Rome depicted the siege of Alesia with chilling accuracy, the double walls, the starving Gauls, the relentless Roman engineering. The show's portrayal of siege towers creaking forward under a hail of fire, that's straight from historical accounts. Even the chaos of close-quarters combat in the tunnels felt visceral and real, far from the clean, choreographed fights of most period dramas. The biggest disservice pop culture does to medieval sieges is simplifying the stakes. It wasn't just about good guys versus bad guys. The siege of Jerusalem, the fall of Constantinople, these were layered human tragedies where famine and fear did as much damage as swords. The Lord of the Rings captures this well in the Siege of Minas Tirith, blending spectacle with the grim reality of civilians trapped behind walls. Yet even then, it glosses over the logistical nightmares, the dysentery, the infighting, the silent terror of waiting for the next assault. What's missing from most portrayals is the ingenuity, the way defenders repurposed everything from church bells to laundry vats for war. At Malta, knights used wet blankets to smother Ottoman grenades. At Chateau-Gaillard, defenders dumped sewage on scaling ladders. These aren't just gritty details, they're testaments to human adaptability under siege. When Kingdom of Heaven shows Saladin's troops using sandbags to stabilize siege engines, it's a rare nod to this problem-solving brilliance. The truth is, reality was often stranger and darker than fiction. Hollywood sieges thrill us with fire and blood, but the real drama lay in the quiet moments. The scribe counting dwindling grain sacks, the mother boiling leather for soup, the engineer adjusting a trebuchet's counterweight by inches. These aren't just footnotes, they're the heart of siege warfare, where patience and creativity meant the difference between survival and slaughter. And that's a story worth telling without embellishment. The echoes of medieval siege warfare didn't fade with the clatter of armor. They evolved, whispering through the trenches of World War I and the rubble-strewn streets of modern cities. What began as battering rams and trebuchets transformed into artillery barrages and drone strikes, but the core principles remained eerily unchanged. Take trench warfare. Those zigzagging ditches weren't so different from the circumvallation walls at Alesia, designed to repel relief forces. Even the stalemate of Verdun mirrored the grinding exhaustion of medieval sieges, where victory hinged not on bold charges, but on who cracked first from hunger, disease, or despair. The real innovation, machine guns replaced arrow loops, and barbed wire became the new moat, yet the goal was identical: control the killing field. Psychological warfare, too, traces its roots to those medieval walls. The Mongols' severed heads and Saladin's midnight drumbeats find their modern counterparts in propaganda leaflets and sonic booms designed to shatter sleep. During the Battle of Mosul in 2017, ISIS fighters broadcast eerie chants through loudspeakers to unnerve Iraqi troops, while coalition forces dropped leaflets warning civilians to flee, a grim update to the medieval practice of firing warnings over city walls before the real assault began. The tools changed, but the playbook didn't. Fear, it seems, is timeless. Urban combat today owes its brutal calculus to sieges like Stalingrad or Sarajevo, where every alley became a murder hole and every cellar a countermine. Modern soldiers clearing buildings face the same close-quarter horrors as knights storming castle stairwells, ambushes around blind corners, booby-trapped thresholds. and the suffocating dread of not knowing where death lurks. Even the mouse-holing tactic used in Fallujah, where troops blast through walls to avoid exposed streets, mirrors medieval sappers tunneling beneath defenses. The materials may be concrete instead of stone, but the dance of advance and ambush remains unchanged. Perhaps the most enduring lesson is the human element. Sieges were never just about tactics. They were about endurance, the will to outlast, outthink, and outsuffer your opponent. From Leningrad's 900-day nightmare to the digital blockades of cyber warfare, the same truths hold. Supply lines decide fates, morale shapes outcomes, and ingenuity trumps brute force. When Ukrainian engineers jury-rigged drones to drop grenades on Russian trenches, they channeled the same spirit as defenders pouring boiling oil through murder holes. War's tools evolve, but its essence, the raw collision of desperation and cunning, stays rooted in those ancient, smoke-choked sieges where civilizations rose and fell by the strength of their walls and the sharpness of their wits. From the bone-shaking impact of trebuchets to the nightmare of Greek fire clinging to skin and water, medieval siege warfare was a symphony of destruction that rewrote the rules of combat. Imagine standing on the walls of Constantinople as the basilica cannon's 1,000-pound stones turned centuries-old defenses into dust, or watching in horror as plague-ridden corpses arced over your city's walls, biological warfare centuries before germ theory. These weren't just battles, they were laboratories of terror where desperation fueled inventions that still echo in modern warfare. The trebuchet's physics-driven precision laid the groundwork for artillery tactics, while Greek fire's sticky inferno foreshadowed napalm's horrors. Even the psychological torment of prolonged sieges finds its mirror in today's drone strikes and cyber blockades, proving that while technology advances, the art of breaking human spirits remains chillingly consistent. Sieges didn't just topple cities, they reshaped civilizations. The fall of Constantinople didn't merely mark the end of an empire. It sent shockwaves through Europe, accelerating the Renaissance as fleeing scholars carried priceless knowledge westward. The Mongols' ruthless efficiency at Kaffa and Baghdad redrew trade routes and power structures, while the blood-soaked stalemates of the 100 Years' War birthed the nation-states we know today. Every shattered gate and starving garrison was a pivot point where the fate of languages, religions, and cultures hung in the balance. Even the legends born from these clashes, from El Cid's stand at Valencia to the tragic romance of Abelard and Héloïse during the Siege of Paris, reveal how sieges seared themselves into humanity's collective memory, blurring the lines between history and myth. So which siege tactic left you most stunned? Was it the sapper's shadow war beneath the earth, or the mathematical brutality of trebuchets reducing towers to rubble? Drop your thoughts below. We love geeking out over these dark marvels of medieval ingenuity. And if you're hungry for more untold stories of history's most cunning battles, don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell. The past is full of secrets waiting to be uncovered, and we're just getting started.